Okay, yes, we are recording now, Tammy. Um, so can everybody see my screen there? It's the Bibliostat Collect login. I'm trying to share here. Everybody see that? Give me a thumbs up. All right, great. So like I said, my name is Sam Shaw. I'm the Planning and Data Services Coordinator at the Library Commission. And today we're going to be talking about the Public Library Survey. And just before we get started, I found that what works best is to actually go through a test survey. So we'll go through that page by page. And if you have questions, feel free to unmute yourself or you can type in the chat. I think Tammy's gonna monitor the chat. So if you have questions as they come up, feel free to go ahead and ask those. Like I said, kind of a question of terminology here. A lot of people refer to this as the Bibliostat survey. It's actually the Public Library Survey. Bibliostat is the name of the vendor that we use to collect the data. And sometimes people get that confused with the name of the survey. The Public Library Survey is a part of a national data collection that's done in all 50 states. It's sponsored by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, or IMLS. So every state collects data as a part of this annual data collection. There are some questions, as you'll see in the survey, that are federally required questions. So those are the questions that every state asks and is a part of the national data collection. And then some states that we think are important to collect at the state level, just like other states collect their own data, we collect our own data as well here. This is kind of the layout of the main Bibliostat page, and most of you, if you're a library director, you should have gotten an email from me with a link to the survey, a link to this page here, and then your ID and password. If for some reason you didn't get that, feel free to email me or give me a call and I can send that to you. One thing to note, if you forget your password, you can always call the Library Commission's 800 number or send me an email. But there's also, if you go to the main page of our website, you can type in lost password and you'll get a link to a screen that'll come up here that says Bibliostat password ID lookup. Like if you were working on your survey over the weekend and you couldn't get a hold of anybody and you lost your password, you can type in your city here, and I noticed it looks like Francine's there, maybe at the bottom somewhere. So you could type in Ralston and hit submit, and that would send the login and password to the director that's on file for that particular city. So that's kind of nice to know if you're working on things and you lose your password. I would say that 90% of the password issues or login issues that we have are due to the fact that people type in a capital letter O instead of a 0. Note that all the login and password information is numbers. So what you see is a 0 and not a capital O, so check that. And the password and login are not case sensitive, so it shouldn't matter if you enter a capital P or a capital N or whatever it is in that part. A few other things that you'll notice on this page here. The survey cycle runs, our survey cycle runs from mid-November. This year we started it a little early on November 2nd through mid-February of the following year. That's the cycle that we use to collect data. Usually from the middle of February for about a month. After that, we're cleaning up data, trying to get surveys for people that didn't submit. And then we're cleaning our data after that to submit it to IMLS. We submit it to them. We get it ready for the accreditation process. A lot of the data that we collect on the survey is used in the accreditation process. And then we publish it on our website. And once we get through the entire survey, I'll show you kind of the end product. You'll notice here that you can print a copy of the blank survey. A lot of people like to print that, do it offline before they actually enter the data into Bibliostat. You'll see another link, 2 links here for Word format and PDF for survey with changes highlighted. So those are the changes that we made to the survey this year, either changes that we made at the state level or IMLS related changes that were made at the national level. A link to the instructions, Bibliostat FAQ. If you want to look at how the federal questions are defined, the federal element definitions are here. We also have the library survey guide for new directors, kind of an overview of the process, introduction to Bibliostat. We also have a flow chart for how to count electronic stuff. The good news for most of you, if you're in the Nebraska Overdrive consortium, we pull that data and pre-fill it for you on the survey. So for holdings and circulation for Overdrive, if you're in the Nebraska Overdrive Libraries group, we'll pre-fill that for you. We sometimes get questions about how to report other vendors or other databases. This flow chart's kind of designed to help you with that. And then, like I said, we pull those Overdrive numbers, but some people want to know where we get them from. So we have a circulation guide here and an Overdrive Advantage numbers guide. Those come from our tech services department on where they got the data from that's pre-filled on your survey. So you might want to pull those reports maybe monthly on your own. That just kind of is a step-by-step process. So we'll go ahead and log into the test survey. And like I said, if you have questions, feel free to type in the chat. Tammy can unmute you. You can also unmute yourself if you want to chime in. That's great. So we'll just click on this link. We'll log into the test survey here. So here's where you enter your ID and password. And I will say one thing that Bibliostat recommends Chrome as a browser. I've used Firefox before. That seems to work okay. It doesn't usually play real nice with Internet Explorer. Chrome is probably the recommended one, but Firefox would be okay too. I think that is a supported browser. I had some issues last year with Firefox with some error codes that kept popping up periodically. So I actually switched to Chrome. When you log in, you should see a screen like this. It should have your library name up here, help, contact, log off. You'll see this year's survey, which is the 2020 survey. You'll have the option to continue to look at the status or to print it. But you'll also notice that you have prior year surveys here that you have just a print icon. So you can log in at any time and print a prior year survey. We also at the Library Commission save a local copy outside of Bibliostat on our local network of your completed survey from prior years, kind of just as a backup in case something ever happened to Bibliostat. So you can always email me if you want that too, and I can send you a PDF of it. So we're just going to click on continue because we're going to start the survey. And then I have to go back because I was in here cleaning data because we use this for the other systems here. So let me go back to the beginning of the survey. You'll notice here that there's some navigation buttons up at the top. It says show status. There's a print icon, a submit. And let me move this over. And then a next and a save button here. You'll notice up at the top that there's also a link that says show last year's answers. I almost always turn this on because it's nice to know what you entered last year and you can kind of compare your data to what was entered the prior year. For most of the questions, we like your data to be fairly close to what you entered the year before, but not exactly the same. Although this year we may see some numbers that are that vary because of closed hours and other things that are going on with a lot of libraries. So we'll just go through the general data here, and if you'll notice here that some of these questions are in purple, what that means is these are the federally required questions. So if you see a question in purple, those are the ones that are federally required. If it doesn't show up in purple, like we'll scroll down here like fax number and web URL, those are in black. Those are state questions. Those are questions that we just collect at the state level here in Nebraska. You'll also, yes?
I got here and was having trouble getting my computer loaded up. where are we to get to this site?
You can go to our website. You don't need to log in. You should be able to see my screen, which shows the test survey that we're going to go through.
Right.
If you want to go to log into your own survey, kind of to follow along, you can go back to the Library Commission's website here and type in Bibliostat to get to the login,
Okay.
like that, and then that'll get you to the login screen.
Okay, I don't have any of that pulled up, so.
Okay. Well, you should be able to see the test survey here. Do you see that?
I see it on my computer. I've got it pulled. I've got you
Okay.
pulled up on it.
Okay, good. So you'll see here that some of these questions have gray boxes. What that means is that these questions are locked, and so you cannot change any of these questions. And the reason that we lock that is because if you went in and say changed your street address to ST instead of street, if it was spelled out, we're going to get an edit check on that, and we'll have to go back in and clean it up later. And so these are usually things that don't change from year to year. In the event that your library did say change its name or move to a new location, you can email me and I can get into those locked questions and change them for you. Most of these, if they have changed, we're going to have to put a note in there to let IMLS know, like for instance, if you move to a new location or you legally changed your name. You'll also notice here on the right, there's a flag button. If you click on that, the flag, do you see how the flag went red? What that's there for is if you're entering your data and you are reminded of something, that maybe some data that you needed to add to the data that you had, or need to give yourself a reminder to for more information about that particular question, you can flag it, and Bibliostat won't let you submit that until you've gone back and looked at that flagged question. So that's kind of nice if as you're going through the survey, if something comes up, you want to flag it so you can go back and look at it later, you can do that, and it won't let you submit it until you take care of that. You'll also notice here that there's a note field. When you get to the end, there's a series of what we call edit checks. So the Bibliostat system goes through those edit checks, and say, for instance, your data was outside of a certain range, or it was exactly the same as what you entered last year, that's likely going to trigger what we call an edit check. And the system is going to ask you for a note. An example of this is if some of you are in the Nebraska Overdrive Libraries group, you typically pay $500 a year for that consortium fee. That typically in the past would trigger an edit check where you'd have to enter a note because the system would say, hey, this is the same as what you entered last year. So you can enter a note here if you know that it's a question that comes up as a federal edit check, or you can wait until the end and actually see if you get an edit check and then enter the note there. You can also enter a state note. So if it's a state question and you want to enter a note explaining something in more detail, you can enter a note here. The local note here is kind of for you on your end. A lot of people might look at the local note, like say they ran a certain report from their ILS for some questions, or from got some figures maybe from an accountant with the city clerk's office. You can kind of enter a local note here that helps you in the next year, so that when you go back and look at that data, you know who to contact for it. You can also look at previous year, like if you entered a note in the previous year, it'll come up here. You can just copy and paste that back. That's kind of nice.
Sam?
And then if you entered a note, you can then just save it here or just close it out. Yes.
Carrie from Alma had a question that they have a street address of City Park West 2nd, but FedEx and UPS require more detailed. Would that be something she'd put in the street address, or is that something she should email you to change?
She can email me if it's the street address that she would prefer that we use, that we report to MLS. She can email me and I'll go in and change it, and then we'll just enter a note indicating that that's the correct address. And then, it'll come up on an edit check. If it's more of a just something on their end, she can just enter a note in the note field. But if we need to change it, if it's incorrect here and we need to change it, have her tell her to email me and I'll go in and change that. And we
Okay.
have that from time to time if libraries, maybe it wasn't entered correctly to begin with. Just email me and we'll get it cleaned up. Okay.
Okay, yep, she put it in chat, so I'm sure she heard your answer. Thank you.
All right, great. So like I said, a lot of these things won't change from year to year. Occasionally they do. You'll see here web address of library director's email address. Your system will be pre-filled with Three Rivers if you're in Three Rivers library system. I think most people here are. Population numbers are also pre-filled. We actually pull those for you. We use the ACS 5-year estimates for those. And you'll notice there's two fields here, one for local population and then population of legal service area. Some of you will have, those numbers will be exactly the same. For some, they may be different. Say a circumstance where your library serves multiple townships or like the entire county. The local population will be the population of the city or the town. The population of the legal service area will be the population of the county. And then again, if you notice that those are off and shouldn't be off, email me and I can go back in and look at those. One thing to keep in mind with legal service area, sometimes we have libraries ask a question about maybe serving a population outside of their particular town. What we look at on our end is whether or not there's an interlocal agreement between the city and the county or whatever entity it is. If there's no interlocal agreement, then this will be pre-filled with the local population number. If there is, then it's an outside area. I think the exception to that is maybe Douglas County, which is gets divided up under a number of libraries based upon the population and the funding that comes from Douglas County to those libraries that are within Douglas County. So you'll notice here there's a question mark again next to some of these questions. If you click on that, you'll get a pop-up here that will give you more information about that particular question or a link to the definition or the actual definition itself. And here that shows us that that's the population estimates from the census. Like I said, the ACS census 5-year estimates. Okay, so down at the bottom, you'll notice two buttons, one that says next and one that says save. If you click on next, it'll take you to the next screen, and Bibliostat is supposed to save your data that's on this page. Although it's happened to me a couple of times and it's happened to other people where they've entered their data and they've lost what they've entered on this page. So I always recommend as a fail-safe to hit save first and then next to make sure that your data gets saved. So that's just one thing. I know that some of the people have reported that. So I always recommend that you hit save and then next. That would make sure that your data does get saved and you don't come back later and maybe it's missing. You'll notice here the number of branch libraries. For most of you, that's going to be a 0 unless you have another branch or a bookmobile. I think there's 7 bookmobiles in the state right now. Again, those are going to be pre-filled. If you had a branch library last year, this will be a 1. Or if you're in Omaha, it'll be however number of branches they have. Same thing with bookmobiles. If you had a bookmobile last year, this will be a 0 if you didn't. If you did, it'll be a 1. It'll be pre-filled for you. We want to know what year your library facility was built, the year of the latest addition and major renovation, whether or not it's accessible, whether you're currently working on a building plan or project, and again, these are just yes or no type, yes or no drop down. Are you doing a fundraising effort for a new or renovated library building? Is construction underway if you are? And then what's the projected completion date? And kind of the reason that we collect this series of questions is we like to, or occasionally we get emails or contacts from libraries that say are working on a construction project or building a new library. And so oftentimes they might want to contact someone that had a project recently to, ask them questions about, to share their experience with the library that may be undergoing that project. That's kind of the reason that we collect that data. And it is useful. We do get those contacts from time to time. You'll notice a series of questions here from 2.10 to 2.20 that are all grayed out, and they have these odd looking codes. These will all be pre-filled for you. If you do need to make changes to that, like we talked about the street address before up here, contact me and I'll do that for you. And if you look here, you'll notice that some of these are the same as what was entered above. You'll notice that library name, street address, and city are the same as what the questions were that we just looked at. And the reason for that is that these fields, 2.10 through 2.20 here, are for library systems that have branches or bookmobiles or multiple service outlets. You'll notice here that the outlet type code is CE. That's for libraries that have one central library. If you had a branch, this would be a BR. So what IMLS wants to know is they want to know for each library that had a branch, they want to know where that's located, what the name of it is, and what the square footage of it is, in addition to all these other codes, and if it has a different phone number, what the phone number is. That's why these look like they're duplicative, because these are for library systems that have multiple branches or a bookmobile. So they want to know the data for each one of those. But for most of you, this is just going to be the CE, because you have one central library that's your main administrative entity. Library building square footage, that'll be pre-filled based upon what you reported last year. If you've renovated your library or moved to a new location, just contact me with the new square footage and I'll get that entered for you. If this was a bookmobile outlet record, this would be a 1 and that would be pre-filled. But for most of you, that's probably going to be a 0. And then 2 things that you do need to enter is your hours open for public service per year, 2.22, and then the number of weeks that the library outlet is open during the year. And one thing that I'd point out, because I know I'm going to get this question right here, I'm going to highlight this. It says extensive hours closed to the public due to natural disasters or other events should be excluded from the count. And IMLS has told us that if your library was closed due to COVID-19, that when you enter this number here, you exclude those hours from the count. And the same thing with 2.23. So the number of weeks you exclude from the count as well. So for instance, if your library is normally open 1,200 hours a year, but you were closed, you were only open 1,000 because you were closed for say a month due to COVID, you would enter 1,000 in here. You would exclude the 200 hours that you were closed from that count. And then same thing here, if you were closed for 4 weeks, you would enter a 48 here instead of a 52. Okay. Does that make sense to most people? I know it's sort of confusing. Okay, so.
Sam, does that include even if you did curbside? Even though
Okay,
your
so
doors
that's,
were closed?
yep, that's another good question. So IMLS has, or people have, we've asked IMLS for some guidance on curbside service, drive-through service, or other type of services during the time that the physical building was closed. And what they've said is that you exclude those hours from this 2.22 and 2.23. So if your library was closed to the public for 4 weeks, but you offered curbside service during those 4 weeks, this number here would be a 48 for 48 weeks. You'd exclude those from the count. Okay. There's some questions, and this will make sense later on because they've added some questions about curbside service and other things in the library services part. Okay. So in other words, actually, here's one of them right here. 2.24, the number of weeks during the year that due to COVID-19, an outlet building was physically closed and the public could not enter when otherwise it would have been open. So in this case, in this example, for the library that was closed for 4 weeks, we would enter a 4 here. So when you look at your survey, the sum of 2.23 and 2.24 should, for most of you, be 52 if your library is normally open for 52 weeks of the year. So you would have a 48 here and then a 4 here. Okay. And then IMLS also wants to know in 2.25 the number of weeks that your outlet implemented limited occupancy practices for in-person services. So let's say out of that 48 weeks that you were open, you had another 4 weeks where you only let 10 people in the library at one time. You had restrictions on the number of people that could come in the building. You would enter the number of weeks that you had limited occupancy out of those weeks that you were open in this 2.25 here. And you can also click on the question mark here and you'll get the IMLS definition of what they have in that definition. And here you'll see an answer to your question, Lori. Here they've added this in their definition. A building can be physically closed but still offer virtual Wi-Fi or curbside services outside the building. So they've tried to kind of answer that question for us in the definition.
Sam, I have a question about that.
Yeah.
So right now the governor has said 25% capacity.
Right.
If it really doesn't impact you, if you've had fewer than that come in anyway, do you include that, or is it just considered a wash,
Well,
not on anything that you put?
I would say if during that time period, if the library itself, had a policy where they limited the amount of people, if it wasn't an issue for them and they didn't have to limit, then you would probably enter a 0 here. But if they actually had to limit the amount of people or had that in their policy, I would add that number. So if it was 4 weeks, you'd enter a 4 here, or 8 weeks, or whatever it is. And libraries, I'm anticipating that these questions will definitely remain on the survey next year, because as we're heading into the fall, a lot of libraries are closing again or implementing limited occupancy practices, as you said, like as we see these health directives that are coming back now. So I don't anticipate that these questions will change much over the next year. They'll probably be on the survey at least for the next fiscal year, maybe even after that.
Amy from North Bend had a question too. What if we're limiting kids and teens from coming in?
I would count that as limited occupancy. So if you limited those kids and teens during, say 3 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever it is, enter that number in the 2.25. Yeah.
Probably since March. A lot of them.
Yeah. 2.25 is basically a subset of this 2.23 up here. So this number can't be larger than 48. But yeah, you could have 48 weeks where you had limited occupancy, really.
And Kathy asks, what about no limits except no programs? That's probably coming up in the program section.
That'll be covered, yeah, and you'll report that programs in the program part. But this question is just asking if you've implemented a practice where you've limited the amount of people that come in the building. So if you just cut programs, that wouldn't be, you wouldn't consider that number in this question 2.25. Okay. And you'll notice here that there's a remove group and an add group. These are what we call repeating groups in Bibliostat. And this is probably not the best example because this would be if you added a library outlet, like if your library system added a branch, you would then have to click on this and enter all that information again for that particular branch, or a remove group if you accidentally hit this and you wanted to just take it out. We'll go over repeating groups at another part of the survey, I think, where it's more applicable in the finance part, but that's kind of the basic layout of it. And then you'll notice here, a lot of these are more codes, IMLS codes that are pre-filled, they're locked. They should be grayed out. FSCS library definition, interrelationship code. These will all be pre-filled for you. I just leave them the way they are. They won't change from year to year. One that isn't, 2.33 here is the sum of all your hours that you entered in 2.22. And for most of you, that number is going to be the same because you only have one central library. The reason that this is in a separate field, again, because like for Omaha, they would enter their hours for each library branch, and then 2.33 would add the sum of all those outlets for the entire Omaha OPL system. And then we have another new question here, which looks a lot like the one that we just entered. It asks, were any of the library's outlets physically closed to the public for any period of time due to the coronavirus? So if you notice up at the beginning, they asked the question for each particular outlet or each particular branch. Here they're asking for a yes or no, because again, as we look at, OPL, one branch might have been closed and the other one might have been open. So if your library, for most of you that just have the one, if your library was closed, if you entered, like we entered a 4 up here in 2.24 because we were closed for 4 weeks due to COVID, down here, we would enter a yes because we were closed for 4 weeks due to the pandemic. Okay. I know it looks like those questions are the same ones that are being asked, but that's the reason, is because they're looking at it from the standpoint of if you had a library with multiple branches, they want to know the detail on the branch level, and then they want to know the detail on the administrative entity level. Okay. Then we'll go over to the library finance part. You'll notice here the start of the fiscal year and the end date of your fiscal year. That'll be pre-filled based upon what you entered the year before. And for most of you, that fiscal year is going to be either October 1 through September 30th, or likely July 1 through June 30th. I think there might be a few libraries that have a calendar fiscal year. I know Omaha does. Omaha's fiscal year, I think, runs January 1 through December. And there might be a couple others that are off, but I think for most people, it's either mirrors the federal fiscal year, which is October 1 through September 30th, or the state fiscal year, which is July 1 through June 30th. So that is the time period that this report covers. So the data that you report is for that particular time period. Like I said, this will be pre-filled based upon what you entered the year before. So let me go into revenue. The first question is local government operating revenue. And if you'll notice here that these questions are in black. So we want to know some detail about what money you receive from the city or the village. So in this case, it looks like last year we had 15,000. Let's say our budget didn't change, and we'll enter a 15,000 again this year. And one thing to note here is you enter for the revenue part here, you enter the funds that are available to you, not necessarily what you spent. So if your operating budget is $15,000 that you received from the city or the village, that's the number that you enter here. So these are questions that normally we'd expect to see in nice round numbers and maybe don't deviate from year to year. Whereas expenditures, it would be unusual for the expenditure to be exactly a nice round number. Township name, if you receive money from the township, you would enter the name here. And let's just enter this as a test, and I'll show you how the repeating group works. So let's say you received money from Tammy's Township. You would enter Tammy's Township here. And then here under 3.5, you would enter the amount. So let's say that we received $500. So you'd enter the amount here. But say we also received money from Francine's Township, because I noticed Francine was on this call. We can click on Add Group here, and that will pull up another empty box with the same numbers here. So then we could enter Francine. And let's say Francine gave us $2,000. So we'd enter that amount there. And then you can keep going on and on and on. If you have multiple townships that gave you money, you could itemize all of them here. That's kind of how the repeating groups work. And if for some reason we made a mistake here and Francine didn't give us $2,000, we can just remove that group there and click on that, and it'll take the group off. Okay. Same thing here if we received money from the county, Gage County, or if we didn't, you can always enter just an NA and a 0 here. Once you submit your survey, when you're completed, I go over and review every survey, and if I notice a blank here, I'll probably go in and enter an NA and a 0 just for the sake of consistency. You can enter it there or just leave it blank if you didn't get any money from the county or the township. Other local government revenue. This is going to be unusual that you would receive money from another local government entity, but say you received money from a local government board. I don't know, maybe would NRD be one, maybe, possibly. I'm not sure if that's a governmental entity, but if it is, a local board gave you money, or a local agency, you would just enter the description here and then the amount here for that. It'd be unusual. It's unusual to have anything there, but in some cases that is the case where you receive money from a local government agency. So we'll click on next here, and you'll notice 3.10 is the total. So we've got the 15,000 that we received from the local government entity, or the city or the village, and then the $500 that we received from Tammy as the township. And you'll notice here that this question's in purple. So IMLS or the feds don't want to know, they don't want to know that detailed description, but they just want to know the total for the local government revenue. So as we like to do with Bibliostat, whenever we can let the program do the math for us, we have it do it here, and it calculates the total for us for $15,500. So then the next section is state government revenue. And you'll notice here that we have a breakdown. We have library state aid. If your library is accredited through the Library Commission and receives state aid, or you receive the $200 for Dollars for Data for completing the survey online, this will be pre-filled for you. We pull those numbers and pre-fill them for you. One thing that we don't pre-fill, and it's more to do with libraries having different fiscal years and trying to determine when the payments were made. We don't pre-fill for library commission grants. We feel like that you're in a better position to know when those funds were received and then which report it goes on to. So here we have a breakdown. If you received a youth grant, a continuing education grant, or another state government revenue, that would include an internship grant would get entered here. Or say you received money from another state agency, not necessarily the Library Commission, but another state government agency, you would add that here to the 3.14. And then in 3.15, again, IMLS wants to know the total state government revenue. So then Bibliostat does that total for us. And then we have federal government revenue. So we have federal library improvement grants. Those are grants that are offered by us, but they use federal funds because we're the pass-through agency. So if you received a federal library improvement grant, I think they were offered this year, so there might be some of those. You would enter the amount here. And then if you received money from another federal grant, for instance, you would enter CARES Act money here if you received a CARES Act grant, either from us or from another local government entity. You would, the way that you would enter that is you would enter the source here. So CARES Act, if it was a CARES Act grant. If it was another grant that came from another grant, you would just enter the source there, a description of what it was. Let's go back and we'll say this is a CARES Act grant. And then you would enter the amount in 3.18. So here, let's say we received $1,000 in a CARES Act grant. We would enter $1,000 here. And again, you had the option to itemize. If you received multiple grants, you could enter an add group or a remove group. If there were multiple grant sources, that's how you would enter that. And then in 3.19, again, this is the total of the federal government revenue. So 3.16 and 3.18 right here. Okay. Any questions on that part?
Amy from North Bend has a question. She
Okay.
said, we received an outside Wi-Fi access point. Do I count that? We did not pay for it.
They received a Wi-Fi access point from
Was that from an ALA grant, Amy?
like a vendor?
As the CARES Act federal. PLA grant.
Oh, a PLA grant?
Yes.
So if it was a CARES Act grant that passed through PLA, you would enter CARES Act here and then the grant amount here. And that might be difficult to determine if it was equipment. I don't know, they should assign a value to that, to those hotspots. If it was just a hotspot that didn't have a value, I wouldn't probably report it at all.
Okay, she says thank you.
Okay. Let's see here. So let's click on next. And in part 3 of the library finance, again, we're in revenue part again. Lender compensation. If your library received lender compensation from us, you would enter that amount there. Regional library systems grants. If you received money from, say, Three Rivers Library Systems, you would enter that there. Let's say we received $400, we could enter that there. And then, like in the example that was given above from PLA, that was a pass-through from CARES Act money, but say PLA offered, I think this was one that came up in another section, say PLA offered a technology grant that wasn't CARES Act money, you would just enter a description here and then the amount there. And maybe that PLA technology grant is the CARES Act grant. I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with that. Some common ones that get entered here are Dollar General grants. Those are outside entities. And I think there's another one. What is it? Kreutz-Bennett, those would get entered into the other part. So say you received a Dollar General grant and a Kreutz-Bennett grant, you would enter the add group and then enter the Kreutz-Bennett in addition to that.
As these are state grants or state information that you're asking for, this is information that you delve into. So if you find that it was put in the wrong place, you can correct that after. It's not something to really stress about, right?
Yeah, I'm not stressed about it. I'm more concerned with the total. A lot of these grants I'm not familiar with, but here in the other part, if you know it's a private entity, enter that there. Some of the other ones, like the PLA ones, if you know that it's a CARES Act pass-through, most of the time you're going to know. Enter that in the federal government part. But I would say those are the common ones. For other outside grants or Dollar General grants are pretty common. Or the Kreutz-Bennett ones for smaller libraries. And then you'll notice a series of totals here, total other revenue, and then total operating revenue. So the total operating revenue is the money that you receive from the city, the township, the state, and then the other part.
Okay, Sam, Carrie from Alma said, so this is where the trust funds go?
I'm not sure what you mean by trust funds, like a library foundation money. Yeah, you would put that under the other source. So that's another common one, library foundation or library trust fund or memorials we see. Those all go under this other part. Library Friends Group, if the library received money from the Friends Group, that would go into this other part. Those are the other common ones. That's a good point.
Okay, good, thank you.
Okay. So then we have capital revenue. And we get some questions about what qualifies as capital revenue and not capital revenue. I usually tell people, if it's something that like say the city allocated, obviously some things here, it gives you a definition here of some examples. Obviously some things are obvious, like, if you built a new building or added on to a building, those are going to be capital revenue and capital expenditures. Those are going to get reported into this capital revenue and capital expenditure part. Some other things maybe might be a little bit more difficult to ascertain. I usually tell people that, if the city, said that, determined that the library needed a new roof or new windows or a new HVAC system, or another what we call a one-time major project. Like here under G, it says other one-time major projects. That would get reported as capital revenue and a capital expenditure. And here you'll see a breakdown. So it's asking for the source. Did that come from the city? Did it come from the state? You might have received some relief funds, like say from the state, like if your library got hit by a tornado and you received some money to rebuild it from the state, you would enter that here. Money that you received from the city would be entered here. And then if it was a federal relief program, you would enter that into 3.28 here. And then in the other section, I would say the common things here are like insurance reimbursements. Like say you had a damaged roof and it needed to be replaced and it was $10,000 that you got from an insurance settlement, you would just enter that here.
Another
and
example,
any other amounts from any other entities up there. Yeah.
Another example of that might be the Kreutz-Bennett does a facilities grant. I know I had gotten $10,000 for pointing a building, which was a one-time thing. That would fit there.
Right.
Is that correct?
Right. And then you'll also notice here, it does give in the description, and this kind of throws people off sometimes when they read it. It says computer hardware or software to support library operations. Kind of the definition here is that if you already have a computer lab with say 10 computers and you replace one or two or all of those, that's typically not a capital revenue project. But say you built a new library and had a new computer lab and you purchased all new computers for that computer lab, then typically that would be a capital revenue and a capital expenditure. Kind of the same things with furnishings here. You notice it says furnishings, equipment, and initial collections. So say you added onto your library and you bought all new furniture for it. That would most likely be reported here as a capital revenue and capital expenditure. But say you replaced a couple of chairs in your children's area, that typically would come from your regular operating budget and not be reported as a capital revenue or a capital expenditure.
Sam, there's a question from Lisa. Said, where would you put money from someone who passed away and left an amount to the library? That would be a memorial, right? Unless it was a large.
Right. So yeah, so that would be up here under this 3.22 in the other section. So you could enter memorials and then the amount, like there. Sometimes people set up trust funds and then they, have a annual distribution from the trust fund. You could put, if it was the lowest green trust interest or whatever, you could put that there and then the amount that you received. Yeah, whenever it passed through from, and sometimes those things pass through the foundation too. So you could enter like foundation memorial, that you received for that particular year during that fiscal year, and then the amount here. So that's how you would enter that.
What about equipment such as like Crickets or 3D printers that is purchased through the regular budget?
Yeah, so those get entered in a different part that we're headed to next after the capital part. So yeah.
Sorry.
Yep. We'll get to that in just a second. Good question though. Now the exception to that is if you built a new makerspace and you bought a bunch of equipment all at once. Say you bought like 10 pieces of equipment to fund a new makerspace and the money didn't come from your operating budget. It was like the city said, well, we're going to give you $5,000 extra for the makerspace. You would enter that into the capital part. But in your example, you're talking about regular operating budget expenditures. So that's right on, I think, the next page. Or maybe 2 pages. So here in the next part, we want to know, does your library charge a non-resident fee? That doesn't include Nebraska card. In some cases, this would be a yes. If you charged out-of-town residents or residents of the county, but not the city, residents out of state, whatever it is, just enter a description here. And then we want to know what the fee was for an individual, what it was, a household, and then the number of cards you entered or you issued during the year, and that includes renewals. So if you have the same person renew their non-resident fee and pay the $25, you would include them there in that 3.35. So we have operating expenditures. We want to know what was paid for salaries and wages. And again, if you have a question about this, you can click on the question mark and it'll come up with a little bit more detailed description of what to include. I would say most of the questions that we get are, and again, you'll notice here, these shouldn't really be nice round numbers because you need to report what you actually spent during the fiscal year. And so it's going to be unusual that amount is going to be exactly the same. And it's going to be unusual that would be exactly what your budget was that you entered in the revenue part. Most of the questions that we get are about what IMLS defines as employee benefits. A lot of people say, I don't have any benefits, but we also include in this number withholdings for Social Security and FICA. So that's kind of the kicker there. You would also include other things that are withheld, like say for health insurance, retirement, stuff like that we would normally consider as benefits, but also Social Security withholding. If you don't know what that number is, a lot of the time you can get it from your city clerk. They would have that information, the accountant would. They can pull it for you. And then 3.38 is just the total of the salaries and wages and the employee benefits here. And then we want to know for the library director if there's other benefits that are offered. And these are just check marks here: health insurance, life insurance. And you'll notice here you can look at what was entered last year. So let's say we now have a health plan. You would just check that box. If none of these are offered, just leave them blank. Professional memberships, continuing education workshops. If you're attending today, this would be a yes. And then other, if there's another benefit, I had a library offer as an example that their library pays for a Sam's Club membership. So you just put that there. If there's other benefits that are offered, just enter a description there. We kind of like to know, occasionally we get salary questions where library A wants to know what the salary of the director is in library B. And then also want to know, maybe what are benefits that are paid to the library director. So then we have, as we talked about, collection expenditures. So we want to know what you actually spent during the fiscal year on library materials in print format. Again, you can click on the question mark. This includes books, serial subscriptions, government documents, or anything else that's a print acquisition. Most of the time, this is going to be books or newspapers and magazines, serials. And then we want to know what you spent on materials in electronic format. This would include overdrive and any other database expenditures or electronic collection expenditures that you had. And this is where that edit check used to come up. For those of you that had overdrive here, you would enter 500 and the edit check would always come up. And you'd have to enter a note that says overdrive consortium fee hasn't changed. But I finally got smart because everybody would always enter that note, and I turned the edit check off. And so you shouldn't get that edit check anymore, because then when we get our final data that we submit, then I'll just pre-fill all those notes for all these that are 500 and 500 every year. Some other common things that you would include here if you had a subscription, like say to Mango Languages or another database, you would add that to that $500 that you spent on overdrive, or 0 if you didn't have any electronic collections. And then under the other materials, this includes audio and video physical units. So that's CDs, DVDs, and anything else. So you'll notice here, microform, a lot of people probably don't have that anymore, but that's in the definition. CDs and DVDs would get entered as other materials. Some other things that you would enter, the common, like some of you have, if you spent money on other circulating things like hotspots was mentioned before. If you spent money on hotspots, that would get entered here in the 3.52. If they circulate and leave the library, cake pans, puzzles, things like that would be under the other materials if they leave the library. If they're just used in the library, you wouldn't report it here. These are only things that circulate.
Amy from North Bend asked, would Vox books be other?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Vox books, VOX?
I'm not familiar with those. What are those?
I don't know. Are those things that are checked out, Amy? It's an audio book for little ones.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It's got a book with the audio player on the book.
Okay, so that's something that's kind of a judgment call on your end. So you would either include that as like if it was a book that came with an audio book, or a book, sometimes books come with CDs, like children's books. You can either report that as a print format material with a CD, or you can report it as, under this other part. But the thing to keep in mind is you don't count it twice. So if you reported it as a book in the print part, you don't also report it down here. And that's true for the holdings information too. So it's kind of a judgment call on your end to report it as an expenditure for a print, which would be a book, or as an electronic, which would be like the CD or the audio part. And we leave that up to you guys.
Thank you.
So in here we have, we want to know what you spent on computer hardware, accessories, and software. Again, like say you replaced a computer and you spent $1,000, you would report that here. Actually, I think I misspoke on the other items. I mentioned hotspots. Actually, hotspots I think would go under this computer hardware and accessories and software. So I suggested that you reported under the other part. No, wait, no, I was right. I'm sorry. If they do circulate, they go under that part before. I was correct to begin with. This would be computer hardware, accessories, and software for use in the library. I apologize.
Okay, now what Amy from North Bend was talking about before was an access point that actually amplifies or sets forth. It wasn't a hotspot, it was an access point.
Right. Yeah, so that would go on. That would go under this 3.54.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah. But if it was something that circulated, that would go under the part that we were on the previous page. And then a common one here is a lot of people might pay for their OPAC, online OPAC fee. So say you had Biblionics for your ILS or Circe Dynex or something like that, and you paid a yearly fee for that OPAC, you would enter that here under electronic access. And then we want to know what you paid for continuing education. And then the miscellaneous category. This includes basically anything else. If you paid rent, utilities, office supplies, insurance, contract for services, and then I think in that makerspace part, did she mention a CNC router?
She mentioned a Cricut or a 3D printer, but a CNC router would be the same.
Yeah, so you would put that under miscellaneous here, down here in the 3.57. And then you could also enter a note, saying, what it was. If you would want to, we used to itemize all this stuff. On the old survey, a lot of you probably remember, we used to ask for expenditures for facility, utilities, all this, and then a miscellaneous at the end. And what I found was that we never looked at that itemized data. We just want to know the total. So that's why we combined it to condense the survey. And then you'll notice here, there's some totals. Bibliostat will total the other operating expenditures and the total operating expenditures, which is, the total from up above and then the total of the other. And then in 3.6, we want you to enter the total capital expenditures. So again, say you replaced your roof and you spent $12,000 out of capital revenue. For that, you would enter that amount here. And it's not uncommon for capital revenue to come or to be reported one year and then the expenditures to be reported the next year. A lot of the time, especially if a library is building a new building, and I think IMLS has turned a lot of those. That used to come up on an edit check, and I think they've turned that off now because that's kind of the definition of a capital project is it's a one-time deal. So it's not uncommon for you to report a bunch of money one year and then zero the next year. Once the thing is over with. So we have library collections and we're moving along pretty good. Does anybody have any questions about the finance part? I know that's kind of tricky sometimes. No?
Actually, I've got one on the non-residents.
Okay.
Numbers, do you still want the numbers if the non-resident doesn't pay?
Oh, so you offer a free or you offer a non-resident card to anyone?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
And I didn't, before we reported it because they were non-residents, but I didn't realize they were paid.
Well, you could still report it. I mean, you could, this would just be a 0 here. So you don't charge 0 here and 0 here, but say you had a 25 that you issued, you could report it that way. And then this would be anyone or no one, no one's charged. Something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good, thank you.
So in the library collections part, you'll notice here, first we want to know about books in your collection. And you'll notice here that this number will be pre-filled. Books held at the beginning of the fiscal year, that'll be pre-filled with what you entered at the end of the fiscal year on last year's report. So this number here will be pre-filled up here. That's what you start with. And then we want to know how many you added during the year. So you added 100. And then how many you weeded during the year. Say you weeded 50. And then Bibliostat will do the math for us. And then I will say sometimes when you enter these numbers, if you want to have that calculated, just click in an open space over here and that'll calculate for you. The only difference is that if this is in a repeating group, it won't calculate until you hit save. So if you don't automatically see that and it's in a repeating group, like in the finance part, hit save and then make sure that it's calculated after that. Then in electronic books, you'll notice this great big, huge, long definition that virtually nobody reads, including myself. The good news here is that this number for ebooks held as a part of the Nebraska Overdrive Libraries group, that'll be pre-filled for you based upon your fiscal year. If you're in the Nebraska Overdrive Consortium through the Library Commission, that'll be pre-filled for you as the holdings. And those numbers are always difficult. Holding, to me, it's more important to know what you spent for electronic materials and how many times they were used. Because the lending models are so wonky with leasing and number of simultaneous uses and everything's changing, I'm not sure that this number really tells us much. It's basically a snapshot of what was available at the end of the fiscal year to the consortium. And then in 4.6, if your library was in a different consortium, I know RB Digital, Hoopla, some people have Hoopla. The thing with that is that you don't include, like I know Hoopla has, hundreds of thousands of ebooks in their collection. If you subscribe to that service, you don't include the entire collection. You only include either the ones that you've selected or as a part of that consortia, or in the case of Hoopla, the number that have been downloaded or used by the patron. And I think that would probably go under 4.7 here, acquired number of ebooks acquired or purchased directly by the library. So that would be where you'd report Hoopla, because I don't think that's part of a consortium. This would also be where you report Overdrive Advantage titles or Advantage Plus. So say you purchased an Advantage title or an Advantage Plus, you would enter that here. Some libraries are also going to be a good example maybe of someone that might purchase local copies as Overdrive Advantage, or if you have a different vendor, you would enter that there. And then 4.8 is just the total of those. And we're talking about holdings here. So we have audio physical units. These are CDs most of the time. Cassette tapes, if you had cassette tapes. One thing to note here in this definition, it says to report the number of units, including duplicates, items packaged together as a unit. For example, 2 audio cassettes for 1 recorded book, and are checked out as 1 unit or counted as 1 physical unit. So if you had an audio book that was 1 title but contained 10 CDs, that counts as 1 audio physical unit. I would say that's the most common question that we get on this. Again, enter the number that you added, number you withdrew. These are numbers that go into the accreditation application. I think there's a points for weeding percentage. That's kind of why we want to know the more of a breakdown. Then here with audio downloadable units, these are audio books. Again, this is going to be pre-filled if you're in the Overdrive Libraries group. If you're in another consortium, you would enter that here. And then if you had Overdrive Advantage or Advantage Plus titles, you would enter those there. And then it'll calculate the total for us. And then finally, we have video physical units. Most of the time, this is going to be DVDs. If you had VHS, those would be included there too. Again, this should look familiar. Number added, number deleted. And then video downloadable units. It's kind of rare that anybody would have this. I think Hoopla would be a good example of a video downloadable. I don't know of any consortiums that have video downloadables. I suspect that Overdrive eventually will offer this, so it's probably going to be an issue at some time in the future. But say your library had Hoopla and there were 500 videos that were downloaded or purchased directly, you would enter that number here. And then we have print serial subscriptions. This used to be a federally required question, but it no longer is. IMLS, there were enough states that voted it out. But we still felt that on the state level, it's important to continue to collect this data. So we left it on the survey. This would be subscriptions to newspapers, magazines. Again, the number that you had at the end of the prior year, and then if you added or deleted any, you would just enter that there, and then the system calculates the total. And then we have the catch-all of other materials. Commonly, this would be cake pans for a lot of people. Sometimes children's craft kits are circulated. Wi-Fi hotspots would be where you would enter those for holdings here. So if you had 10 Wi-Fi hotspots, you would include those in the other materials that circulated. Did someone have a question?
No, I just commented puzzles.
Puzzles, yeah, if they circulate. Yeah, the number of times that they would, anything like that. We've kind of tried to include the common ones up here. But if it's, the catch-all is any other items that circulate to the public.
There is a question from Laura at Fremont.
Yeah.
Says, jumping back a bit with a question regarding RB Digital and Overdrive, the Central Nebraska Co-op RB Digital collection was moved over to Overdrive September 29th. Will those numbers be in our pre-filled Overdrive counts then?
They won't be on the survey. Last year, I got those numbers from Sump Memorial Library. I think I worked with Matt Kovar and Caitlin up there to get those numbers, and I emailed him a couple of weeks ago to see if we could pre-fill those numbers again, and I haven't heard back from him. So I would say if you're working on your survey, I think he's the one that took over when Jake left, if I'm not mistaken. I would probably contact him up at some, or actually they've changed the name. It's Papillion Memorial Library now, or Papillion Public Library. Contact him, and then if for some reason I do get that spreadsheet of pre-filled data from him, I will email everybody in that consortium and let them know that I've received the data and pre-filled it. But that's a good question, because I'm not sure where the cutoff was, where Overdrive purchased them, and so I'm not sure how that overlaps with your fiscal year. Does that help, Laura?
Yes, thank you.
I know it's that was always an issue before because there were so many different platforms under that RB Digital umbrella, and a lot of them were some were permanently retained by the patron and others weren't, and that makes a difference in how we report it.
And then Francina Ralston said Acorn TV would be video downloadable back on the 4.7.
Acorn TV.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that either. I do know that like a lot of the video downloadables are what we consider patron-driven acquisition, and so the library pays per download or per use. I think Hoopla has that model, maybe Acorn TV, I'm not sure. And so you would report the number of uses in holdings and also the circulation category. And that's confusing too.
Right.
That's kind of, if you go back to that, on the main page, we mentioned that little flow chart that we had. Let me just see if I can get back on there. That was meant to kind of clear that up, and it may cloud the waters even more. Let me just pull it up here since we're ahead of schedule on time. So here's the questions that you would need to ask yourself. You know, does Acorn TV require user authentication? You know, yes or no. If it does, you know, is there a loan period? Or is it permanently retained? If there's no loan period, you report it kind of in the database section. If there is a loan period, you kind of report it as you would report it as a video holding and then a video downloadable circulation. You know, as these models change, getting them to fit into one particular category is always difficult because we want to count this. I mean, these are things that are valuable services that are offered by the library, and we want to demonstrate that on the state level and then on the national level too. Okay.
Thank you.
So how are we doing on time here? I think we were going till noon today, and then we were going to clean up tomorrow. Is that correct?
Right.
Did we want to break there and come back for the library services and technology tomorrow, or did we want to take a look at library services today? It doesn't matter to me.
Does anybody have a preference? Heather from Wayne said it's good to break. Yeah, if you're at the stopping point where you expected to be.
I think this is a good stopping point because then we can come back tomorrow and go through the library services and technology, which shouldn't take too long, but a lot of the IMLS added a lot of COVID related questions to the library services part. And so we can go through those tomorrow first thing.
Yep, that sounds good. Did anyone have any questions about what he's covered so far though?
No,
I think
thumbs up.
everybody's ready for a break, so. Yep, great information. Everybody does appreciate you, Sam.
Let me see if I can stop this record. Okay, here.